Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Hathcock, and today we'll be looking at industrialization and urbanization. Just kind of looking at the growth of the United States after the Civil War. A lot of this industrialization and urbanization, truth be told, is taking place up in the northern states, not so much down south. We'll talk about what's happening down south as we go later on in the course. Okay, so looking at American growth after the Civil War, it was huge. It was just about unprecedented. In those decades after the U.S. Civil War, you have immigrants coming from Europe by the tens of millions. You also have immigrants coming to the United States from Asia at the same time. Also, at this time, you have a lot of urbanization or city growth. People start to sort of leave the farm, leave rural or farm side areas of America, and they're coming to the cities looking for work, looking for a place to stay, just trying to scratch out a living after the Civil War. So industrialization really does bring in a lot of immigration, whether that's from Europe or Asia. It also brings people from the farm to the city after the war. The country is expanding to the west with new states. Railroads are paving the way out west. The economy itself is starting to go up. So there's just a lot of growth in the country after the Civil War. Okay, well, for an industrial revolution to take place, it turns out you have to have certain components in play. And all of these components are necessary for an industrial revolution. Having two of the four won't cut it. Having three, you could do okay, but it really takes having all four of these components working together at the same time to make an industrial revolution happen. The British were the first nation to industrialize. They beat everybody else to the punch. And really, the reason why the British were the first ones to industrialize is because they were the ones that discovered the steam engine. That's kind of the technology aspect of things that you need for an industrial revolution. The Brits, in discovering a steam engine, really at first their steam engine was used for mining operations. It would rain over in England. They would have these mines where they would dig for coal. That's COAL, coal. So you'd have these digs taking place, and then it would rain. These coal mine operations would fill up with water, and you had to kind of wait for the water to drain out, to dry out, and it just kind of took forever and a day. So they figured out how to make a steam engine work to control a pump. This made the pump work that pumped the water out, so those mining operations would dry up faster, and you can get your guys back in there to work faster. So really, it just sort of started out as coal mine operations using water pumps. But then the British figured out, hey, let's put this engine on the back of a boat. Let's see what will happen. And the next thing you know, the steamboat is born. They would later say, okay, well, let's put it on the back of a horseless carriage, and the train would be born. And truth be told, the early factories, whether those were in England, France, or the United States, factories forever were powered by steam engines as well. That's before electricity comes along, anyway. So the steam engine is really what brought on the Industrial Revolution. And like I say, it was the Brits who were the first ones to figure all that out. But okay, let's look at these components that are necessary for an industrial revolution. Let's start with labor. So you have to have workers. You have to have sort of a lot of people who are looking for work, looking for jobs. And sadly, what you're looking for, aside from a large labor pool, really is a large labor pool that you can exploit. You're going to pay these people a fraction of what they're worth, especially in the industrial age when it began. People really were paid a fraction of what their value and their worth. So it's not just enough to say you need a large labor pool. They would use large labor pools that they could exploit and take advantage of. That's brought in by immigrants coming in from the East Coast. From Europe into the East Coast. from Asia into the West Coast. And again, you've got all those people moving from the farms into the cities. So yes, America had a massively large labor pool that it could exploit and take advantage of. Okay, natural resources. I've always told my classes that really America is it's a little bit of a unique country for a handful of reasons. I think one of them is the Constitution. But another one of the reasons why America is really a unique nation is just this abundance of natural resources. The United States is so blessed with natural resources. Um, Always has been. Well, these things are finite. I don't know that they'll last forever, but we've always had this abundance of natural resources. You know, you can think whatever age it is in human history, um, ever since there's been an America, and it's always had those natural resources. I guess at first America had a lot of trees, a lot of wood, a lot of timber, if you will. Wood, timber is how everything was built in the 1700s, going into the 1800s, everything. Houses, ships, furniture, but it's also how you cooked food. It's how you stayed warm. So lumber, wood, timber, however you want to put that, America's always had a lot of timber. In fact, a lot of those forests of the east coast of the United States were chopped down and cut down to build things like the British Navy that would go on to dominate the world. So America's always had lumber. But then you think about going forward, you get into an industrial age, and one of the big resources that you're going to need is coal, COAL. Coal is something that you shove into the steam engine to make it go, to give it heat, to build up that steam, to make the pump work, to make the engine work. So coal is a natural resource that the United States has in abundance as well. Whether it was coal mines in Kentucky, West Virginia, we still have people who get out there and risk their lives in those coal mines to dig up coal because it still is, even now, a vital resource. But truth be told, in today's world, we've got a lot of robotics involved, and there's a whole bunch of safety regulations involved with coal mining operations. But we've always been blessed with an abundance of coal to keep those steam engines going during that industrial revolution. Let's see, another natural resource that the United States has is oil. Now, even before the combustible engine was invented, even before cars and gasoline, you needed oil in the industrial age. Oil really was used primarily for two things. One was it was used as a lubricant. You've got like machinery. Just think about a train, how it's kind of set up where the wheels are attached to these big bars. You've got all these metal parts moving, and sometimes they sort of grind. You have to have oil to lubricate those metal pieces, those metal parts, to keep them from getting too hot and seizing up and breaking. That's not only true for, excuse me, trains, but also in factories. You have those steam-powered machines that are working in factory settings, and they need oil as well to lubricate those parts. So oil before the age of the automobile really was a lot about lubrication, but it was also used for kerosene. Kerosene lamps. It's how we used to light our cities and our homes before electricity. Yeah, truth be told, we did have candles, but kerosene gave off a brighter light. So oil was a natural resource that America did have, does have, continues to have. Uh, like oil in Ohio, oil in Texas, oil up in Alaska. So America really has always been blessed with oil. Oil in the Gulf of Mexico as well. And so that when the age of the automobile hit, when you get into combustible engines and you need gasoline, America's going to have plenty of gas in that age. Some other resources that I would kind of throw in there, cotton. The United States is going to have a huge supply of cotton before, after the Civil War. Cotton is heavily used for most of the clothing that we wear in the modern world. So cotton It'll be a huge player in the Industrial Revolution, selling cotton, making profit off of cotton. But some other things are various precious metals, gold. Find a lot of gold out west. Silver. Going to find a lot of silver out west, places like Colorado, for example. But a really big precious metal is copper. We're going to need copper wiring for things like telephones, electricity. So copper is something that we've mined a lot out of places like Minnesota. And so copper mining and copper mine operations will be a big thing. So you put it all together, and the United States really has had an abundance of all these natural resources: wood, coal, oil, cotton, precious metals like gold, silver, and copper. And I don't know what the future holds. I really don't. But in the future, you'd like to think that humanity would want to keep the power on, keep things going. And I don't know, maybe the future is nuclear energy. Maybe it's nuclear power. It could be. I don't know. But we've got uranium sort of sitting out in the desert Southwest, just waiting to be had, just waiting to be gotten at, if nuclear power is the future. So yeah, our country has always been blessed with an abundance of natural resources. Okay, our third component to look at here is capital. Capital is money, but really more than that, capital is a willingness to invest. Like people who are willing to invest money in ideas, projects, factories, whatever it might be. And I don't know, the United States is based on a capitalistic society, a capitalistic idea, a free market economy, if you will. And coming out of the U.S. Civil War, we've got quite a few capitalists or investors who are willing to take risks in the search for greater rewards. We've got guys like J.P. Morgan, who we'll talk about here a little bit later in our lecture. John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, sort of these titans of the industrial age. But yeah, the whole premise behind a capitalistic society is people will become what are called venture capitalists. They're willing to put their profit, their money on the line, risk it in an effort to make greater rewards. So America's been blessed with capital forever and a day. Last not least is technology. And really, the biggest technological advance of the Industrial Revolution is the steam engine, as I mentioned earlier. With steam power, it opens up so many doors. Again, steamboats, railroads, powers factories, allows for greater productivity of products. So technology is the big thing of that age. It was the British who were the first ones to invent the steam engine, but very quickly the French stole the plans and the ideas. Pretty much if England is doing it, the French are going to play catch up as quickly as they can. So it's like those two big European powers were the first two nations to industrialize. But not too far behind those two are the United States. What emerges in Central Europe is Germany. Starts out as Prussia, but ultimately will become Germany. So yeah, those are sort of like your first big industrial powers are England, France, the United States, Germany, there after the U.S. Civil War. So our country truly has been blessed with all of those things, and I've just given you examples of each. And like I don't know, it took like the Chinese forever to industrialize. They had labor, they had resources, they could steal the technology, but capital, money, was something that was holding them back. Same is true of the Russians as well. They didn't have all these things working at the same time. So you got to have it all at once. America has been blessed to have all four of those components working at once. So yeah, you might look at your possible essay topic sheet, and it tells you, there's one of the essays that could be about the components that are necessary for an industrial revolution. So one last time, they are labor, natural resources, capital, and technology. Okay, well, after the Civil War, there's this huge push to renew various railroad projects. Now, the really big railroad project that was agreed to before the Civil War started was this idea of having a route that would connect New York City to Chicago, then from Chicago on out to the San Francisco Bay. This goes back to the Kansas-Nebraska Act that you would have studied in first half American history. Stephen Douglas manipulating things to get the railroad to go through Chicago. That project was started. There was track being laid from Chicago heading out to the west. But then, I don't know, something big called the Civil War erupted, and something like a massive railroad project kind of got pushed to the side. But with the war over, there's this big push to go forward with new railroad projects. So, in building these railways, what they're really looking at doing after the war is building what we'll call transcontinental railroads. Transcontinental means it spans the continent. It goes from the East Coast to the West Coast and all points in between. These transcontinental railways. The first big railway project to get completed was the one that went, it ended at a place called Promontory Point, Utah. You can kind of see on this map that I've put up there. If you look out at the Utah Territory, kind of look in the middle of the map, just slightly to your left, you'll see the Utah Territory. You'll see where there's some blue on the top of that. That's the Great Salt Lake. And right above the Great Salt Lake is a little point called Promontory. And that's Promontory Point, Utah. On the right-hand side of your slide, you can see a picture on the top right where these two trains are kind of connected. There's a whole bunch of people gathered around. It's actually a very famous photograph. It's in May of 1869. The first transcontinental railroad is completed in American history. This is the photograph of that moment where the two lines meet at Promontory Point. One line was being built from Chicago heading out that way to Utah. The other one was started out in California, and it also was making its way towards Utah. And they did eventually meet there at Promontory Point in May of 1869. In that moment that you see there in the top right hand of the slide, like there were, I don't know, the telegraphs went off to let the entire country know that the great task had been completed. People held dances and barbecues across the country. It really was this sort of a euphoric moment for the United States in being able to build a railroad to connect the East Coast to the West Coast and all points in between. By the way, the whole point of these transcontinental railroads, it really is about the economy. It's about selling products. Most of them, be honest with you, are manufactured back east in factories. Those products could then be shipped all across the United States to be sold, whether that was Fort Worth, Texas, or a Denver, Colorado, even all the way out to a San Francisco, California. So it's about capitalism. It's about expanding the U.S. market. But something else that was driving these transcontinental railroads was the desire to sell U.S. products in Asia. And that had been a dream forever, of making a railroad go from New York to Chicago. Then it could chugga chugga choo choo out to San Francisco, California, where you could put those products on boats, ships, really. Those ships could sail across the Pacific Ocean, and then you could sell that stuff in China, Japan, Korea, somewheres out in the Pacific. So the transcontinental railways, yeah, it's about travel, it's about connecting the country. But really what it is more than anything is it's about connecting resources to factories and then factories to markets. If we were face to face, I would draw that up on the dry erase board. That the railroads were connecting resources. Like imagine cotton being grown down in the South. Trains will pick up that cotton down in like a Jackson, Mississippi. Then it'll chugga chugga choo choo that stuff up to some factory in New York or Boston. That's connecting resources to factories. Then in those factories, they'll turn the cotton into clothing, put it back on a train and send it out to the market, which could be anywhere. A city in the United States, a city on another side of the world. And so that's how it connects those factories to markets. So one more time, what trains do, or the transcontinental railways do, is they connect resources to factories and then factories to markets. Okay. Well, along the way, the United States government helped these railroad companies out. U.S. government made sure that these railroad projects did succeed. There was a lot riding on these renewed railroad projects after the Civil War. The government gave these railroad companies land, just like wherever you lay your track. They would give them so many acres along the line that the company could sell, do whatever they wanted to with it. They gave them money, just flat out. Here's money. Uh, get the train built faster. Here's money for more stuff that you need. They gave them tax breaks. So the U.S. government really did help these railroad companies lay that track all the way out to the west. One of the big reasons why the government helped is because we have so many people living back east after the U.S. Civil War. And then you've got this tidal wave of immigration coming in from Europe at the same time. And along the eastern seaboard, you've got cities that are just packed. Think New York, Boston, Philadelphia. They really need people to head west and look for opportunity out west. And the best way to move people to the west would be through trains. It's safer, it's faster. You can do it in mass. We needed people to move out west, to get out of the east and move west because, number one, the cities are overcrowded back east, which also means, number two, you have high rates of unemployment back east. You have people looking for work in cities where there's really no work to be had. So, yes, the government absolutely helped these companies out along the way to help with the overcrowding of cities back east and to create new economic opportunities out west as well. Because I swear, everywhere the railroad went, it brought with it economic opportunity. It brought jobs. It brought economy. It made the situation better, economically speaking. On that note, I always give the example of Hunt County. Excuse me. So Hunt County is in Texas. It's out where Greenville, Texas is. You go past Collin County, and then you would be into Greenville County, heading out that way. But Hunt County, after the U.S. Civil War, it really was just a small farming community. It's just a bunch of dirt poor farmers trying to scratch a living off the land. And one thing that Greenville or Hunt County as a whole had was it was in the middle of something known as the Blacklands of the South. This was, in calling it Blacklands, they were referring to how like the dirt, the soil, was so rich in nutrients. Look, I'm not into cotton production, but apparently it was really good for growing cotton. These Blacklands that were in East Texas that spread on into Louisiana and Arkansas as well. So you got this soil that's really rich in nutrients. It's really good for growing cotton. But the problem with cotton production in Hunt County was transportation costs were so incredibly high. They knew they could grow cotton there, but they also knew that it would cost you a whole lot of money to try to transport that cotton to a market. What people really would do is they'd put it on the back of these wagons, these oxen, those big old beasts. Excuse me, oxen would carry the cotton over into Louisiana. Then they try to get it onto various rivers to get it down to New Orleans and try to sell it. And like the transportation took forever, it cost so much money, and it wasn't even worth it almost to grow cotton out in East Texas. So after the Civil War, the good people of Hunt County got together and held what's called a bond election. The voters of Hunt County agreed to generate revenue, this come off tax dollars, in a bond. And they were going to use that money to give to a railroad company that would lay track through Greenville, Texas. They would lay their train tracks through that city with a stop there in Greenville, Texas. They did get a railroad company to agree. By 1879, there's a railroad track running right through the county with a stop in Greenville, Texas. And like overnight, in the 1880s, Hunt County becomes one of the fastest growing counties in all of the United States. Not just in Texas, but in all of the United States. Because now those East Texas farmers can grow that cotton in that rich soil, and they can put it on a train and ship it off to a factory. And the transportation is fast, it's cheaper, and Hunt County just explodes overnight. It went from being just this sort of backroad country with a lot of dirt poor farmers to having banks, businesses, hotels, modern amenities, flush with cash. So wherever the train went, that's what it did. It brought economic opportunity, jobs, and some level of prosperity. But I do think it's important to note this. The government did help these railroad companies. See, in later years, the railroad companies would say, well, hey, we built this all by ourselves. You can't tell us what to do with our companies. And the United States government will say, well, actually, we gave you money and land and subsidies. Uh, and the Constitution does allow for us to step in and do what's right for the workers of America. So, yeah, these railroad companies will claim that they can do what they please, that they built these empires themselves. That's not an accurate statement. The United States government did help these railroads out. It also helped out a lot of these corporations. You'll see that as we get into the next slide. But the government did help the railroads grow. Okay, so having these railroads connect north, south, east, and west really triggers this rise in big business in the United States. You start to see the formation of what are known as mega corporations in our country. Truth be told, there had been businessmen in the United States before, during, after the Civil War, but they could only go so far in terms of accumulating wealth. You take a guy like a John D. Rockefeller, for example. Like he could control, say, the Ohio oil industry. He could really dominate in the, sort of that Great Lakes region of the world. But there was a ceiling. They could only go so high. But with the rise of the railroads, the transcontinental railroads, you also then begin to see these big businesses explode. Guys like Rockefeller take advantage of the fact that they can now sell oil anywhere in the United States. And you do really start to see the rise of these empires, such as Standard Oil. So let's look at big business in the United States. We'll look at Rockefeller. We'll go to Carnegie. We'll go to Morgan as well. But I believe that any talk of big business in the United States has to sort of begin and probably end and in the middle contain the name John D. Rockefeller. John D. Rockefeller is the icon of business and wealth in America. He really sets the standard for what it is to be a businessman. Now, that's not always um, very virtuous. Sometimes there's some negative connotations with that. But yes, John D. Rockefeller really did set the standard for what it was to be a businessman in America. Now, John D. Rockefeller, as a child, his mom said that she knew that he was destined to be something great. She said that young Rockefeller as a boy, she used to make him chocolate. In an age before like chocolate bars and Hershey's and things like that. When kids wanted candy, usually it was something that their moms would cook for them. They would sort of make chocolate candy, chocolates, in their home. But Mama Rockefeller said that what the young John D would do is she would cook these chocolates. She let them cool off, and then she would find him out on the front of their property, their front porch, if you will, and he was selling his chocolate to the local kids, like to neighborhood kids for like pennies and things like that. And rather than eat his own chocolate candy and save it for himself, he was out there selling it in an effort to try to make some money. So yeah, Mama Rockefeller knew that her son had I don't know, he had a knack for business, if you will, a knack for making money. Kind of a side note to that, really sad story. John D. Rockefeller really hated his father, and for good reasons. His father was a bit of an alcoholic. And John D. said that he could remember being awoken in the middle of the night sometimes to the sound of his father coming into his room, kind of breaking into his penny jar and taking his money to go to the bar to buy something to drink. It's kind of sad, you know. The kid was selling his chocolate candies to set aside a little money, and then along comes his alcoholic father, taking those pennies out of his jar to go get a drink. By the way, extra side note on that, John D. Rockefeller swore he never touched alcohol. He never drank even so much as a sip of beer or whiskey. A lot of that goes back to his father. He saw what alcohol did to his father, and yeah, he had no use, no need for any of that. All right, well, John D. Rockefeller also said, as a young man, that he wanted to accomplish two things in this world. He said, number one, he wanted to live to be 100 years old, and number two, he wanted to make over $100,000. Well, many years later, when he passed away in 1937, he was 98 years old, so I almost got to that one. And as far as making over $100,000, this man goes on to make millions upon millions of dollars. If you translate it into today's money, he was worth billions and billions of dollars. So I'll take that. I'll take being 98 years old, and making millions and millions of dollars. So he didn't quite accomplish all of his goals, but yeah, it was nice to be John D. Rockefeller in his time. Well, when John D. Rockefeller started out as a businessman, he was in the oil game. He was a wildcatter, a prospector looking for oil. He was mainly based out of Cleveland, Ohio. And what Rockefeller would do is he would go out and just look for oil. I'm sure you've heard these stories where, you got these guys that get out there and they drill. They drill into the ground hoping to hit one of those pockets, hoping to hit where that oil is. I'm sure you've also kind of seen where, like, when they strike it, the oil just comes spewing out of the ground. So that's what he was. He was a wildcatter, a prospector out looking for oil. Whenever he did hit oil, he would then sell that oil to these people who were called refiners, these guys who were in the oil refinery business. And John D. Rockefeller, just being sort of the smart, astute businessman that he was, starting out as a wildcatter, he just sort of looked at the situation and said, so, okay, I get out here and I scramble around and I look for this oil, and then I sell it to these other guys who take the oil and make a massive amount of profit. So he begins to think in terms of, how can I become one of those refiners? Like, how can I be the guy who makes more money? So John D. Rockefeller was a guy who had no problems with saving money. He really was a man of simple tastes. Like I said, he didn't drink. He didn't go to excesses and things like that. He had no problems with eating like peanut butter and jelly sandwiches for a little bit to save up some money. So he would scrimp and he would work and he would save. And he would go on to found something that a company that he called Standard Oil. He said he named it Standard Oil because he said he wanted his company to be the standard by which all other oil companies would be measured. And before it's all said and done, that's exactly what he achieved. That would be the standard. That company would become the standard by which all other oil companies would be measured. So he's now in the refinery business. Now the wildcatters bring the oil to him. And in that refining process, you can take oil and he would sell it for lubrication. Like I was talking about earlier, lubrication for trains, for factory settings. But really what Standard Oil made the vast majority of its profit off of, early on anyway, was kerosene. His empire really was kerosene for lamps across the United States. Like I said, kerosene is how we used to keep the lights on at night. Cities across the United States would have kerosene lamps on their street corners. And when it got dark, it was somebody's job to go around and light all the kerosene lamps on the city streets. Also, just in individual homes, people had kerosene lamps. So really, Standard Oil's vast majority of its profits was off of kerosene, making kerosene lamps. That in and of itself makes profit. It's a good life. But Rockefeller, just being the guy that he was, so driven, so ambitious, I'll use the word so greedy. It just drove him crazy at times that like he had to give money to other people. Like he wanted all of the profit to go to him. So one concept that he'll embrace, that he'll perfect, is this concept known as vertical integration. Vertical integration is basically you control the means of production from beginning to end. You control the entire process of selling your product to the point that all the money goes to you. It's sort of the top of everything. Here's how vertical integration works. So Rockefeller refines oil, turns it into kerosene. He now has to sort of transport his oil to the refineries and then transport the kerosene that's produced out to the market to be sold. So John D. Rockefeller made a deal with train companies, with the railroads, where they would give him a discounted rate and he would ship in bulk with them. That was a little agreement that he had with the railroad companies for a while. But at some point, like say 1873, the railroad companies went to Rockefeller and said, "Look, you're one of the richest men, not just in America but in the world. You're not getting the discount anymore. You can more than afford to pay your fair share of transporting your oil and your kerosene on our trains." So they stonewalled him and they refused to give him the discounts that he used to get. So in his anger, his rage, and his refusal to give in, he just decided to build his own pipeline. And he would connect the oil out there in the fields through to his refineries through a pipeline. He builds the first oil pipelines in human history, just so that he doesn't have to pay the railroads those rates that he didn't want to. Oh, by the way, side note to that, the railroads lost a fortune by not having John D. Rockefeller as a customer anymore. And a lot of economic historians agree that that move by Rockefeller is what caused a depression or a panic to kick in 1873. The railroad companies lost money. It had a crippling effect on the economy. So, like this guy not using the railroads probably triggered the depression or the panic of 1873. But that's how he was, all the profit had to go to him. He just was about squeezing every last nickel that he could. You think about what it takes to get oil going anywhere. It takes barrels. He used to have to pay a company to use their barrels. So Rockefeller said to heck with that. He bought his own barrel making company. And so now not only does he produce in-house the barrels that he's going to use, but he also sells those barrels to other people as well. So again, that's vertical integration. You're controlling the means of production from beginning all the way to the end. From getting it out of the ground to getting it on a shelf for somebody to purchase. That's what Rockefeller's all about. Now, another thing that John D. Rockefeller did very well was he basically monopolized the oil industry. Now, Monopoly is more than just a really fun board game. Monopoly is basically one company controlling an entire industry. And what Rockefeller did in building his empire is he undersold his competition. So, like if his competitors were selling kerosene for, let's say, 25 cents a gallon, he would just one day decide that he was going to sell it for 15 cents a gallon. And he would build up his war chest. He would set aside money. Again, this is a guy of, he doesn't have expensive tastes. He's not a guy who's going to go out and buy flashy things. So he saves up money. He builds up a war chest. And then he just sort of does something where he's selling kerosene for 15 cents a gallon, whereas his competitors are selling it for, like, say, 25 cents a gallon. Then he sits there and watches as his competition goes bankrupt, as his competitors fall apart because they can't keep up with that price. And one by one, as his competition goes out of business, he would buy them up. He would just make them offers they can't refuse, and he'd buy them, take them over. And once he had taken over all the competition in an area, like imagine he's bought out all the oil companies in, say, Ohio, for example. Then suddenly he would do another drastic move where he would now make the price of kerosene jump up to 50 cents a gallon, like 50 cents, 50 cents a gallon. Um, and that's what monopolies would do is they would take over a market, they take over an industry, and then they would gouge customers with unfair prices. It's like if he would have just competed at the 25-cent level, consumers could buy kerosene for 25 cents a gallon. But then he goes and throws it down to 15 cents. Everyone buys his product. They're not buying the competition. The competition runs out of money and goes out of business. He gobbles them up. And once he has no competition, then he jacks the rate up so high that it goes up to 50 cents a gallon. He basically doubles it from 25 cents on up to 50. And I mean, at that point, his attitude is one of, well, okay, well, if you don't want to pay that price, go buy kerosene from somebody else. Oh, wait, there's no one else to buy kerosene from? Oh, well, I guess you're going to have to pay my price and buy Standard Oil. So that is something I want you to understand as we go forward as a class, that uh, that these monopolies, these mega corporations, these monopolies, what they're doing is, number one, they're killing competition. And number two, they're leading to unfair prices. Later on in our class, we're going to talk about a fellow named Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt, in going after the monopolies, is going to say, competition is the essence of capitalism. Competition keeps you on your toes. It keeps you innovative. It makes you research new products and new ideas. But if there's no competition, then our companies get lazy and they don't really care to innovate and come up with new things. Theodore Roosevelt would go so far as to say that competition was the essence of America and capitalism. So he sees the monopolies as, number one, just going against the essence of America, the essence of competition. But also Roosevelt will say, it's just not fair that they gouge their consumers, their customers with such high prices. So yeah, Rockefeller does that to the oil industry through Standard Oil. If you were buying kerosene in the United States in the latter part of the 1800s, you were more than likely buying Standard Oil kerosene because he just truly came to dominate the market. So, all right, so there's one example of a mega corporation, Standard Oil with John D. Rockefeller. Now let's look at the next fellow, Mr. Andrew Carnegie. This is a rags to riches American story, if ever there was a rags to riches American story. Andrew Carnegie, when he came to this country, he immigrated from Scotland at a very young age. His father over in Scotland was going from job to job. He'd work in a place and get laid off and work for somewhere else and get laid off. And so his father, sort of bouncing from job to job, just decided that it was time for the family to move to America. He'd heard of great things about this land of opportunity and freedom. So the Carnegie family, and it wasn't just like Andrew and his nuclear family, his father and mother and siblings, like aunts and uncles went on this trip as well. So it's like a big chunk of the Carnegie family takes a boat ride across the Atlantic. And at first he'll arrive in Philadelphia. So he'll come through Pennsylvania into Philadelphia. And I don't know, Andrew Carnegie he had the basics of an education. He knew how to read and write and things like that. But I wouldn't say that Andrew Carnegie had like this great, um, you know, big time education that was fully funded. And, I wouldn't say that he was getting sort of an Ivy League schooling. He really just was given the basics of an English education and kind of ran with the rest of it. Very smart, very analytical, just sort of a genius when he grows up to be a man. One of the first jobs he ever had was with the Pennsylvania Railroad Company, the PR&R. I don't know why. I always think of monopoly when I'm doing this Industrial Revolution thing because it has bearing on things. But one of the railroads you can get in monopoly is the Pennsylvania Railroad, and he did work for the Pennsylvania R&R. He was a young man when he signed on to work with the Pennsylvania Railroad. He worked with the telegraph systems, things like that. His bosses, the people who ran the Pennsylvania R&R, they said that as a young man, Andrew Carnegie would always be the first one there to go to work in the mornings. So they said that sometimes they'd show up and there's this kid Carnegie sort of sitting there by the door waiting for somebody to unlock it so he could get in and get to work. They said that as he worked throughout the day, he stayed busy. He kept working. If there wasn't something to do in that moment, he would clean his station, he would sweep, he would wipe things down, but he was always working. They also said that when it came time to go home at the end of the day, he was like the last one to leave. They'd literally have to say, "Look, kid, get out of here. I want to go home to my family," so they could lock the door. So first one there, doesn't complain, doesn't cause problems, does the job. One of the last ones to leave. That's called a work ethic. And yeah, Andrew Carnegie showed his bosses that he was a hardworking young man. And he also showed them that he was very gifted and talented. He was full of ideas. During the Civil War, the Pennsylvania Railroad Company worked very closely with the U.S. government, transporting supplies, troops, things like that. It really was this huge task to sort of organize the trains' comings and goings and where they were. And Andrew Carnegie played a huge role in working the telegraph lines and sort of organizing the movement of trains during the U.S. Civil War. I'm not saying that he alone was moving the freight of the Union Army, but what I am saying is he played a huge role in sort of organizing that effort, figuring out ways to make it more efficient, and using the telegraphs for constant communication. So that he proves himself to be brilliant, a thinker, an organizer, a guy with real business aptitude. As he's getting older, he's taken under the wing of the Pennsylvania R&R. He's a protege. They're sort of raising him to someday rise within their ranks. And, that's a good life, high-level player in a railroad company making good money. But, like, if that was the end of his story, I don't know that he would be in this PowerPoint. I don't know that we would be talking about him right now. But just this poor immigrant kid who arrived in America, worked hard, becomes this protege rising star in the railroad business. And along the way, he saw an opportunity. And there's that old saying, when opportunity knocks, you got to open that door. But opening that door can be scary. The opportunity in question was Carnegie saw this chance to get into the iron business. That is to say, the manufacturing of iron. So there's this big iron mill that becomes available. It's called the Homestead Mill. Excuse me. It's right outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and it comes up for sale. So Carnegie liquidates his assets. He borrows money from a bank. He takes a huge risk and he buys this Homestead Mill. And now he's going to be involved heavily in the production of iron. Now, I did have a bit of an ace up his sleeve, if you will. He had an agreement and understanding that he could sell iron to the Pennsylvania Railroad. You just think about it, all those tracks being laid out to the west. They were using iron at first to lay down those railroad tracks. So Carnegie had a buyer, I guess you could say. And, that's a pretty good life for him. But then I guess fate intervenes. You know, so many of these stories of these rich guys are sparkled. There's like the sparkling of fairy dust or magic or something in them. But there's this story about how Carnegie, he travels over to Europe. He goes to England. He's kind of going around London, watching shows and plays and doing things that tourists do. But being as he's in the iron production industry, he goes and checks out some of the ideas that the British are putting forward, some things that they're doing. And what he sees in his time there in London is basically the future. As there's this company in London that's working with this concept called the Bessemer process. Now, this Bessemer process is a scientific idea. It's this way of being able to take iron, putting it through this process, and out of that will come steel. So really what the Bessemer process is about is the mass production of steel. taking iron, removing impurities that exist within iron. It uses oxygen. You have to vent air into this big cauldron at just the right moment. When that happens, the impurities are taken out of the iron. Then when the iron is allowed to cool, it is steel. Steel is stronger than iron. It handles stress a lot better than iron. So Carnegie is sort of watching this idea, this process of how to mass produce steel. After being in London, he went up to Scotland to visit his family, his relatives. He was actually supposed to stay in Scotland with his relatives and visit his homeland for like 3 months. He stayed for like a couple of days, kind of kissed his grandmom on the cheek and said, "I got to go." Gets back to London, gets back on a big ship, comes back to the United States, hires the best scientific minds that the country has, and basically says, "Look, there's something called a Bessemer process. This is what I saw. Go. One of y'all figure out how to use this process to mass produce steel." American scientists will perfect this process. Carnegie is the first man really to have it in a functioning way. So Andrew Carnegie, who had been sort of the Iron Man, becomes the Man of Steel through this Bessemer process. And overnight in Homestead and Pittsburgh, they're going to start mass producing steel. That meant everything for the future of the United States. By the way, I can't help myself. Football, the NFL, Pittsburgh, their mascot is the Steelers. That goes back to Carnegie, the steel mill, all that sort of stuff, right? The Pittsburgh Steelers, Homestead Steel Mills located in Pittsburgh. So Pittsburgh is going to be this huge steel production area for generations to come. All right, so just think about what that meant. And he's the first one to have it. He's going to monopolize that entire industry. It's just he's going to take the whole thing over. So let's think about what that means for Mr. Andrew Carnegie. Let's see. So all those railroads are going to stop production almost immediately, and they're going to wait for steel to arrive out west. Now they'll start making those tracks out of steel rather than iron. Excuse me. Let's see. So cities across the United States are going to start using steel for construction. And whereas our buildings could only go so high because, iron, wood doesn't handle the stress that well, with steel, we can build skyscrapers. We can take our buildings to the highest of highs. And high-rise buildings, sky rises, skyscrapers start to pop up across the American landscape. Let's see. The United States military, the Navy in particular, is going to look to start building a modernized fleet. They're going to look for an Atlantic fleet while at the same time building a Pacific fleet. And they want to use steel in producing those ships. Steel-plated hulls, steel guns on the top decks. So yeah, the military is going to start using steel, producing its various weapons, ships, you name it. The automobile is eventually going to become a thing. We're going to start building cars, and they have to have steel frames and steel chassis and things like that. So steel was the future, and Andrew Carnegie held the future right in the palm of his hand. And he absolutely monopolized that market. If somebody tried to compete with him, he ran them out. He undercut them. He bought them. He saw to it that he controlled the steel industry in the United States. He couldn't control everything, but he sure did corner that market and monopolize it to the best of his ability. I've heard tell that to work for Andrew Carnegie was not fun. Those steel mills, you can just imagine they've got these massive cauldrons. They're full of all that, all of that heated up iron. They just talked about how hard it was to work there. The grind, the physicality, the heat from all those massive cauldrons and the temperatures that it took. People who worked for Carnegie put in 72 hours a week. 6 days a week, 72 hours. The only reason they didn't work people on Sundays back then is because the Bible said you had to rest on the Sabbath. The Bible hadn't said that they'd have worked in 7 days a week, I swear. So yeah, 72 hours a week in very physical, hard conditions is what it was like to work for Mr. Andrew Carnegie. All right, so this immigrant Scotsman who arrives on these shores with really nothing, not much at all, through hard work, aptitude, and ability, rises to be this very powerful man. And that's a rags to riches story if ever our country has truly had a rags to riches story. Mr. Andrew Carnegie. Yeah, here's those cauldrons I was talking about. Those big things pouring all that hot, molten iron into those cauldrons. Just tough, grueling work that these men would have to do, putting in 72 hours a week. Okay, last not least, probably the richest man of them all was Mr. John Pierpont Morgan, or J.P. Morgan. Now, J.P. Morgan's family, his father in particular, came from England. His father was a financier, a banker, if you will. His father ran a whole series of banks that were called the House of Morgan. These were primarily London-based banks that J.P. Morgan's father ran. Very prominent, very wealthy individual. But J.P. Morgan's father recognized that America had a bright future ahead of it. America was expanding. It needed capital investors. So the House of Morgan, which was really based out of London, moved its operations to the United States. Excuse me. J.P. Morgan himself was born here in the United States. He went to the best schools that money could buy. He grew up in a life of privilege and wealth. He was born with a silver spoon in his hand, and he died with a silver spoon in his hand. That's relatively speaking. Figuratively speaking, I mean. But J.P. Morgan was basically groomed from an early age to become a financier himself, to take over the House of Morgan and to take over his family's fortune. J.P. Morgan was educated here in the United States. He went to schools in Europe where he studied finance and things like that. So J.P. Morgan was really groomed and prepared to be a capital investor. All right. Well, one of the early things that J.P. Morgan really got heavily involved with was electricity, of all things. He would go on to found a company called General Electric, along with Thomas Edison, because J.P. Morgan understood that electricity was the future. It's like one of the first things he ever saw that really just convinced him. It's crazy. Of all the things, it was a toy train. He was over at Edison's workshop, and Edison, was talking about he needed so much money for investing, he needed this much money for research, and Morgan was just sitting there playing with an electric train that Edison had put up. He was just laughing and watching it as it would go around on the table. And J.P. Morgan basically told Edison, he said, "Look, sure, we'll get you whatever the money is, whatever you need." And J.P. Morgan said, "I'd like to keep this train if I could." And Edison's like, "Fine, I mean, this guy's bankrolling you. He can take what he wants, right?" But Morgan said, "Yeah, I want to take this train. My daughter's birthday is coming up. I want to give this to my little girl." So yeah, the thing that really got him into electricity was watching a toy train go around on a table. He and Edison do go on to found General Electric. There's a whole story within that where essentially you get into these electricity wars between Edison and a fellow named Nikola Tesla. Eventually, Tesla's ideas prove to be better. Tesla comes up with ways to produce more wattage, more power in electricity. And eventually, J.P. Morgan will decide to switch from Edison and go with Tesla later on down the road. But he's heavily involved in the electricity business. By the way, his father advised him not to do that. His father said that was like witchcraft and sorcery, and it wasn't really a practical thing. But JP knew better. It wasn't witchcraft. It was science, bringing about energy and electricity. But JP Morgan really invested in everything: electricity, mining operations for gold, silver, copper. He did everything all at once. Shipping industries and things like that. But along the way, J.P. Morgan decided that he wanted to sort of consolidate all of his holdings into one big company, and he decided to go after Carnegie Steel operations. That is to say, that he wanted to buy Carnegie's U.S. Steel. So there's this story where J.P. Morgan leaves a ticket at a train station for Carnegie to use. Excuse me. He basically tells Carnegie, "Hey, look, there's a ticket waiting for you. You need to get on that train. You need to come up here to New York. I've got a business proposition for you." So if J.P. Morgan leaves a ticket for you at a train station, I don't care who you are, you get on that train, you go hear what that man has to say. Carnegie travels up to New York, where the two of them will meet. Basically, Morgan will wine and dine the guy, take him to fancy restaurants and things like that. But after all the wining and dining is over with, story goes that Morgan looks across the table at Carnegie and says, "How much will it cost to buy you out? I want to buy U.S. I want to buy your steel mills." Carnegie thought he was joking. He threw out what he thought was kind of the ridiculous sum of $1.5 million. And without batting an eye, J.P. Morgan said, "Okay, who do I make that check out to?" And like there in a New York restaurant, J.P. Morgan just buys out Andrew Carnegie. Side note to that story, by the way, Carnegie essentially retired, traveled the world, got heavily involved in philanthropical efforts. I don't know, built libraries for kids across the United States and things like that. So Carnegie would just live off the wealth for the rest of his life. But J.P. Morgan, in taking that over, he'll go on to found a company named U.S. Steel. Here you can see I put the U.S. Steel corporate logo on the PowerPoint. It looks an awfully lot like the Pittsburgh Steelers helmet, the Pittsburgh Steelers team logo, and that's exactly what happened. The Pittsburgh Steelers just used the U.S. Steel logo, put it on their helmets for their team logo. Under J.P. Morgan's guidance, U.S. Steel goes on to really dominate the steel industry on a planetary scale. There were years where U.S. Steel alone outproduced all of Europe. I'm talking about France, Germany, England, countries that were manufacturing steel. U.S. Steel alone was outproducing Europe together, collectively. When the New York Stock Exchange crashed in 1929, U.S. Steel was the blue chip stock that you could buy. It was the number one big product of its time there on the market. All right, now in looking at Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Morgan, I also want to emphasize that the government did help these men out in many ways. They did give these guys tax breaks. They would sometimes give them subsidies. A subsidy is where, like, the government basically says, here's $100,000. Go do something good with it. Go create jobs or do some research or something. Probably the biggest help the government gave these guys, though, is it simply just stayed out of their way. And the U.S. government just allowed these guys to pay their workers whatever they wanted, work them for however many hours they wanted. The government really wasn't intervening in things like a minimum wage or maximum hours or safety standards and things like that. So really, the U.S. government just looked the other way a lot of times, all the time, really, and let these guys just control their empires however they pleased. But again, later on down the road, the government will start to look at the plight of workers, and the government will say, "Hey, you can only work your people for 40 hours a week. Hey, you should pay your workers at least a minimum wage." And guys like Morgan and Rockefeller will say, "Who are you to tell me what to do with my empire? I built this with my bare hands. How dare you tell me what to do?" And the government will say, "Well, actually, we've helped you throughout the years with tax breaks and subsidies. And honestly, the Constitution is about creating a more perfect union. So, yeah, we can step in and do things like a minimum wage and a 40-hour work week." So these guys like Morgan Rockefeller, they're not going to be very happy with the U.S. government when it gets involved with trying to help labor. Okay, now to look at all this impact, this industrial growth and what it meant to people's everyday lives. There's no denying that the Industrial Revolution brought about some really positive things. Science and technology were giving us all kinds of new conveniences and amenities. One positive that you have to say is jobs were being created. Now, sadly, job growth wasn't keeping up with the pace of immigration, especially European immigration. So, yes, we were creating more jobs, but we were still having unemployment problems because of high levels of immigration. But one positive is you have job growth. Another positive is there's a higher standard of living. Just our lives have more conveniences and more ease thanks to the Industrial Revolution. You just think about it, electricity, a light bulb, right? The ability to power homes, fresh, clean running water, toilets that flush, and take things away to sewers. All of those are great, higher standards of living. I've always sort of imagined like just this some person in New York City who rents one of those modern new apartments, walks in and probably just sat there and flicked the light switch for like 5 minutes and just smiled like, this is amazing. I just flipped this switch and the light comes on. Or like went over to the kitchen sink and turned on the faucet and there was fresh running water. Probably started, thinking about their childhood and having to go out to like a well and with a bucket bring in water and things like that. So just those nice higher standards of living that we get out of the Industrial Revolution. It absolutely is an improvement to the American way of life. But you've also got to admit that there were negatives involved with the Industrial Revolution too. One of the negatives of all this is the exploitation of the workforce. People were gouged. They worked long hours for low wages and miserable conditions. So that's one negative is, just the plight of workers and the exploitation that they faced. But another big excuse me, another big negative that begins to emerge is the formation of monopolies, as well as then what monopolies ultimately become are trusts. And here in the on the PowerPoint, you can see this artist rendering of an octopus. His tentacles are controlling things like government, communications, resources, and that's what trusts sort of were, these big entities that seem to control everything all at once. Well, I've already talked to you about the negatives of a monopoly. And just one more time, monopolies kill competition and they lead to unfair prices. But then you get into the age of the trusts, and the trusts are like monopolies on steroids. The trusts are where you bring all these businesses together, all these monopolies together, and you really control entire regions of the United States. There was a company called Northern Securities Trust Company, NSTC for short. We'll actually talk about NSTC again later in our class when we get to the progressive age. But Northern Securities Trust Company basically controlled all the railroad lines from the state of Washington, sort of all the way through to Chicago and all points in between. It basically controlled the rail lines there in the northwest of the United States. It killed all of its competition. It controlled that entire region. And it would charge people who use the railroads out that way like 4 or 5 times the normal rate that you should have to pay to use a train. There was nothing people could do about it, though. There was no competition. The NSTC, the trust itself, controlled all the rail lines in that part of the world. So trusts were these big things, these conglomerates that controlled politics, resources, communications, areas. I mean, you can make the case that in turn of the century United States, that is to say 1900 America, there's like 12 individuals that control the country that are just that rich, that powerful through their trusts. They have politicians on their side. They control the resources. They control the means of communications. And they really did gouge and exploit their customers as well as their workers through those trusts. So there are positives in this industrial revolution. That nobody's denying that. But there are also some negatives that are really kicking in as well. Now, this next point, in looking at a conservative philosophy, is basically trying to explain why people allowed that. Like, why were people okay with being exploited, being gouged, and things like that? Not everybody was, and eventually people would start to fight back. But historically speaking, we really are a pretty conservative country. In fact, our two political parties from, say, beginning of America through to the 1890s was like all conservative all the time. Really, the only difference between our political parties forever was one was a little more conservative than the other. Whether it was Democrats or Republicans, both of our political parties really were conservative in the latter part of the 1800s. Both openly talked about a concept known as laissez-faire. Now, laissez-faire is a French word meaning to let something do what it's going to do. Don't get involved, hands off, just let something naturally play out. What laissez-faire really means is the government should not be involved in the economy. The government should not be putting its hands into the economy, trying to manipulate it in any way, shape, or form. Now, both of our political parties in the latter part of the 1800s said that they were laissez-faire, but there was a distinguishing point between the two political parties. And it really is kind of like this. Democrats were 100% committed to laissez-faire. The Democratic Party was the more conservative party of the two at that time. And the Democratic Party said, we truly are laissez-faire. We don't want to be involved in the economy at all. We don't want to help the rich. We don't want to help the poor, the working class. The Democratic Party says we should not be involved in the economy at all. In fact, at that time, the Democratic Party's motto was to defend the Constitution, fix potholes that might develop in roads, and stay the heck out of everybody's way. And that really was their basic philosophy, just to be laissez-faire and hands-off, small government that's not really involved in things. Well, the Republican Party professed to be laissez-faire, but it wasn't really at that time. The Republican Party of the latter part of the 1800s did not help workers, that's true. Did not get involved in labor legislation or minimum wage and things like that. So the Republican Party was laissez-faire when it came to the working class, but it was very hands-on when it came to the corporations, to the railroads, to the rich. It went out of its way to help companies succeed. It went out of its way to build those railroads and help them succeed. So, yes, the Republican Party is laissez-faire when it comes to the workers, but it is not at all laissez-faire when it comes to the rich, to businesses, to banks, to things like that. So that laissez-faire concept, that idea that the government should not be involved in the economy, really kind of goes back to Andrew Jackson in the 1830s. You'd have to take first half American history to fully explain that. But definitely post-Civil War America, the Democratic Party is completely committed to the concept of laissez-faire. Oh, by the way, Andrew Jackson had been a Democrat. And the Republican Party is laissez-faire when it comes to labor legislation and workers, but not really when it comes to corporations and the wealthy. There's also this idea of what liberty meant in the United States, looking here at liberty and individuality. Yes, we were, as Americans, free. We had liberty. We had rights. And the idea was that you, as a free person, you had the liberty, you had the right to go out and try to earn as much money as you possibly could. You had the liberty, the right to go out and become a millionaire if you worked hard enough at it. But yes, you were free to go out and try to strike it rich. But you were also just as free to fall flat on your face and go broke, and starve to death in the streets. That comes into individuality. There was this concept in our country that you as an individual are responsible for your life. The hope is as you grow up as a kid, you get an education, you work hard, you learn, you do things right, you show some accountability for your life. And if you do those things, good things should happen to you. You should go on to get a good job and make money and provide a living. But that individuality concept, it really was about, yes, you're free to become rich, but you're just as free to starve in the streets. And there wasn't no like government going to step in and help you out. There wasn't any like workers' compensation or I don't know, Social Security benefits that you could collect. You were very free to go try to make it rich, but you were also just as free to starve, fall flat on your face, broke, starve in the streets. You could go to churches for charity. You could go to various places to try to get help, maybe a soup line or a bread line or something like that. But the United States government did not feel any sort of I don't know, an obligation to you if you should fall flat on your face. Now, I don't know, that pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality, it's a big part of American history. And it does motivate a lot of people. But, I mean, you got to think about in this industrial age, post Civil War America, just massive rates of unemployment. I mean, you had people who were willing to work, who tried to work, who looked for work. There just wasn't work to be had. And they want to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. They want to do the right thing. But, I mean, if you can't find a job, you can't find a job, right? So, I don't know. You can sit there and you can talk about this ideal of, you're responsible for your life. If you starve, it's your fault. I don't know, man. What if you're raised by abusive alcoholic parents? What if you never had a positive role model in your life growing up that showed you the right thing to do? What if you're growing up in an area where there are no jobs to be had because of high rates of unemployment? There's like a human element to this stuff, is what I'm trying to say. Okay, the next point, the Puritan work ethic. So what the Puritans believed, going way back to like 1600s America, the Puritan work ethic really was this idea that God would give you sort of a calling or a purpose in life, and then it was up to you to make that calling or that purpose happen. Um, I don't know, maybe you would want to be a teacher, a lawyer, a doctor, something. Sort of God would fill your heart with that purpose. And then it was up to you to work hard, get an education, sacrifice, struggle, save, to go on and achieve that dream of being a doctor, a lawyer, whatever it might be. And the Puritan work ethic really was more about finding happiness in the world. Like it wasn't about getting rich. It was about fulfilling God's purpose, becoming who you're supposed to be, finding your niche, your place in the world, and just finding happiness through that hard work and that effort. But then we get into this age of the Industrial Revolution. We have the rise of these mega corporations and these wealthy guys, and it just sort of got warped into this idea that only the rich were glorifying God, that we must all of us work to become millionaires and just, go for every penny we can get. And it wasn't so much about happiness in the industrial age as it was just getting rich, making money and becoming a millionaire. So we kind of warped our own uh, Puritan work ethic, the idea that had been there forever in our history. We warped it from finding happiness in life to you got to go out and make as much money as you can and strike it rich, and only the rich bring glory to God through their efforts. All right, now let's look at a weird concept developed by some weird people. This thing called social Darwinism. I'm going to kind of take it for granted that you understand Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. This idea that species, that animals, that living creatures adapt over time to their conditions. Man is very adaptable. Man has risen to the top of the food chain. So we are survival of the fittest, if you will. I guess humans are the fittest, and we survive. Well, that term survival of the fittest wasn't even actually coined by Charles Darwin. It was coined by the guy that you see here, Mr. Herbert Spencer. He's very British with his mutton chops and his long sort of beard. But Mr. Herbert Spencer was a social Darwinist who took Charles Darwin's concepts and ideas, and basically he applied it to human society. And what Herbert Spencer argued was um, human society is like the theory of evolution. The fit or the rich. And like we as human beings, if we're going to survive, we have to work hard, we have to get rich. The unfit are the poor, the starving, the unemployed. And Herbert Spencer actually said this, social Darwinists actually said this. They said, if we can get to a point in the future where all the poor just die and go away, we would have a utopian world. we would live in a perfect society. But we got to get rid of the poor. They've got to die. They've got to go away. That's very theory of evolution. That's very Darwinist. Survival of the fittest, right? That the rich would be left and the starving, unemployed poor would die and go away. That's not a very humanitarian outlook on things. It's amazing to me that these people had an audience with their just cold-blooded approach to human society. But for real, when Herbert Spencer would come to the United States and speak, he would talk to packed houses. He would, talk to audiences in New York and in Boston and Philadelphia. Packed house. When he would get done speaking, people would stand up and clap and applaud. He actually would say right here in the United States that not all men are created equal. Man, you talk about just going against the fabric of the basic beginnings of our country, right? The Declaration of Independence, and all men are created equal. But Americans loved it. They couldn't get enough of it. They thought that Mr. Spencer was right. We're so close to a utopian world. We just get the starving die to go away, or the starving poor to die and go away. We'll have a utopian world. So that led to a lot of fit, if you will, air quoting the heck out of fit, rich people feeling like they didn't need to give to charity or arguing that the government should not get involved in the economy to the benefit of the working poor. Because if Mr. Spencer's right, if we can just not help the poor, and then at that point they either rise up by they're pulling themselves up with the bootstraps or they die and go away. So survival of the fittest, baby. If we can just keep the government from helping the poor, they go away, and then we live in this utopian paradise of a planet or of a society. So that led to people saying, hey, look, I don't want the government to pass a minimum wage. I don't want the government involved in setting 40-hour work weeks because I'm a social Darwinist and I believe that you just let the starving poor die and we'll be a better world once they're all dead and gone. Again, not a very humanitarian outlook on things, but that conservative philosophy, that conservative ideal, I mean, there will still be people talking social Darwinism like in the 1930s, the 1940s. Who am I kidding? There are still some fringe people now in the year 2022 who argue social Darwinistic ideas that we shouldn't have a minimum wage, that we shouldn't have a 40-hour work week, that we shouldn't do things to help the starving poor. They need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and find work. Never mind that they're trying to and there's no jobs to be had. Anyways, rather than digress, I'll just go on. So there are these social Darwinists who are out there arguing that if you help the poor, you're going to destroy any chance that we have of a utopian society. Okay, well, Mr. Horatio Alger is going to sort of carry us out to the end of this topic here. Horatio Alger was a journalist. He was a guy who wrote for newspapers in New York, had a real gift for writing, but very quickly realized that as a journalist, he could make a decent living, but he wasn't going to make a lot of money. So Mr. Alger decided to start applying his talents at writing to making novels. So this journalist turns novelist, but the novels that he's going to produce aren't really Shakespearean works. There are these nickel and dime novels referred to as the Alger novels. They're really easy to read. Their plots are kind of the same. You just changed up the names. But here on the left-hand side, we have Hector. He's a newspaper boy. Someone in his family dies. He inherits money. The next thing you know, he's living in a penthouse. Here we got Jed, the poorhouse boy, grows up on the farm, works hard, saves money, shows some aptitude and skill. Next thing you know, he's running some business. And what these Alger novels hit on is this rags to riches story, which we Americans really do love. We love our rags to riches stories. We love our Alexander Hamilton story. We love our Abraham Lincoln story. Heck, we love our Andrew Carnegie story. Carnegie's a big story at this time. In fact, a lot of people who sort of support the conservative philosophy I was talking about, they would say, looking at social Darwinism, they'd say, hey, look, that Carnegie dude got here as an immigrant with nothing, worked hard, sacrificed, struggled, showed aptitude, and now he's one of the richest men in the country. Like, there's a blueprint for success somewhere in there. And if the government starts, passing minimum wages and 40-hour work weeks, that's going to screw up the blueprint. Like, however it was that Carnegie got rich, I want to follow that model, that method. And these Alger novels are really hitting on that idea that there's a path to success, there's a way to make it happen. Never mind that in these novels, there's always just a little sprinkling of fairy dust, right? Some fortuitous thing that'll go your way. But these novels really are hitting on this thing called the American dream. Now, I really do believe that there is an American dream, in the sense that we all dream of doing great things with our lives, right? Or doing what it is we have a passion for. Again, I guess the Puritans would have called it the Puritan work ethic. Finding happiness, fulfilling a dream. But the American dream, it is a real thing. I see it every semester. Every time I'm in front of students and I'm lecturing and I'm talking, a lot of times what I'm thinking is, these young people, they want to do something with their lives. They don't have to be in college. They don't have to pay to go to school. You could go get a job and just work that job. But the thing is, I think college students sitting in those chairs, like, you want to do better with your life. You want to go on to get a degree. You want to go on to do great things with your life. It drove me. It really did. I used to work at Taco Bueno. I used to work at Best Buy. There's a scene in my life where I was working at Best Buy, and this guy with a broken VCR, and yeah, I said VCR as a long time ago. This guy with a VCR, it's broke, and he's cussing at me. He's yelling at me. I'm trying to help him. I'm trying to give the customer some help, but he all he wants is a new VCR. He's screaming. He's yelling. Manager comes over. Now he's screaming and yelling at the manager. Eventually the guy just leaves. He's angry. But like the way that guy cussed at me and talked to me, it was completely uncalled for. What I really wanted to do was clock out, meet him in the parking lot, and give him a taste of my mind. But the customer's not always right. I don't care what anybody says. The customer is not always right. Sometimes the customer can be a flat out jackass. But I sat there and I waited for work to end, and I was just watching tick 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 as that clock finally struck 10. I was able to go home. I worked at the Best Buy in Louisville, not the modern location. It was actually on the other side of Highway 35 when I worked there. But I was driving back home to Denton. I was going across the Lake Louisville Bridge, and it just hit me in my anger. I was like, is this really what you want to do with the rest of your life? Do you want to fix VCRs for people who get upset and cuss you out like a dog? And the answer was no. I did not want to do that with the rest of my life. And so the next question was, okay, well, what do you want to do with your life? And to that point, I was in college. I was giving it a good try, but I didn't have direction. I didn't know what I was going to do. And I just, in that car ride home after some guy cussed me out, I said, I like history. I know it's a weird thing, but for me, it's what I like. I like reading the past and figuring out why people made the decisions they made and did the things they did. I like history. So from that moment on, I dedicated myself to getting a bachelor's degree in history. Then I said, I could take a little more punishment. I went on to get a master's degree in history, and then I said, you know what? I haven't had enough pain yet. I could do a PhD. I could go on to get a doctorate, and that was tough, man. That was a lot of reading, a lot of studying. Yeah, it was tough. But I went on to get the PhD as well. And look, I'm not some like J.P. Morgan here. I did not grow up rich at all. I grew up low middle class. My parents worked hard for everything they got. I feel like they instilled in me a work ethic that I continue to have, and I'm trying to instill into my kids. I promise you, I did not come from the greatest of beginnings, but I've always worked hard. I've always tried to improve. I got an education. I got a degree, and so like now, the joke's on Tarrant County College, man. They pay me way too much money to have the fun that I have teaching American history. Um, I enjoy what I do. I love waking up in the morning and knowing, hey, today we're going to talk about, I don't know, Andrew Hamilton, J.P. Morgan, whatever it might be. So I've always challenged students on this. Like, what is it that you like to do? What is your American dream? Probably it's going to involve working some Joe job that you hate, but you got to pay bills, right? And put gas in your car and put food on the table. Probably you're going to have to take some college courses. while you're working that job. It's tough. It's hard. Trust me, I've been there. I empathize. I really do. But I swear to you, if you'll stick it out, I swear to you, if you'll get that Puritan work ethic in you, hard work, sacrifice, struggle, and you could get a degree someday, and you could go on to live your little slice of the American dream as well. So to summarize this topic, an industrial revolution hit, and there was no going back. Everything was going to fundamentally change in the American way of life. This industrial revolution brought some positive things, uh, created more jobs, led to a higher standard of living, brought on new science, technology, and products. But it also had with it some negative effects as well, like the exploitation of the working class and the rise of the monopolies and trusts. What we do with the next few topics that we're going to look at, the labor movement as well as the populist movement, is we're going to look at how everyday Americans at that time reacted to the Industrial Revolution. The labor movement is basically looking at the people who worked in the factories. The populist movement is looking at farmers and how they reacted to the Industrial Revolution. So a lot of what's coming next in the topics to come is, okay, there is an Industrial Revolution. This is what it does to the country. Now let's look at how these various sections of the country react to that Industrial Revolution. All right, well, that's it for this topic. Have a nice day.